Chapter 16 is about the condition of the empire from Antonines to Probus. This is the period of what I call military rule, and historians call this period the crisis of the 3rd century, where Rome had little stability at the head of the empire, came under nearly constant threat of invasion from barbarians and others, and revolt within, and no longer had an army that could really deal with it. Montesquieu begins chapter 16 praising the wise and virtuous leaders of the Antonine dynasty, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines, who commanded the respect of the soldiers and who led the empire wisely and moderately, protecting its borders, settling defeated enemies within the empire, spreading them out, and forcing them to integrate. But they did also set Rome up for military rule. After praising the Antonines, Montesquieu writes this: "When new monsters took their place, the abuses of military government appeared in all their excesses." Then the chapter catalogues the monsters, the pretenders, the civil wars that defined the Roman Empire during this period, with repeated, interrupted, and somewhat mysterious emphasis on Caracalla. The chapter ends with a praise of the Illyrian generals that began to engineer Rome's comeback, such as it was. Quote, "After Gallienus was killed, Claudius, Aurelius, Tacitus, and Probus, 4 great men who, by a stroke of luck, succeeded each other, re-established an empire that was about to perish." There is much in this statement, very much. Gallienus had ruled for a long time, the longest rule of an emperor since the beginning of the military rule by Septimius Severus. Roughly, Gallienus ruled from 253 to 268 AD, but the time was one of constant insurrection and revolt among the army and invasions from the barbarians. Rome was losing its empire, and things were falling apart. The military infighting had made it hard to withstand the barbarian invasions, and in fact it invited them. The barbarian invasions created opportunities for commanders to attack one another. Gallienus' father, Valerian, was captured by the Sassanids of the Middle East and beheaded. It's kind of a miracle that Gallienus survived as long as he did. Montesquieu mentions this on page 154. As the terrible disorder of the succession to the empire reached its height, one saw 30 different pretenders appear at the end of Valerian's reign. And that's a nice way of putting it. And during that of his son, Gallienus, they destroyed each other, for the most part after very short reigns, and were proclaimed tyrants. Gallienus could do nothing about this. But could something be done? Was the end near? As Montesquieu himself says, the empire was about to perish through dismemberment and through military revolt and indiscipline. In any event, the Illyrian generals, from the province of Illyria that is near modern-day Albania, they turned things around. But interestingly, Montesquieu doesn't tell us anything about what they did. We are only told that it was by a stroke of luck that they succeeded each other. Attributing their line of succession to luck is interesting, especially in light of what Montesquieu says in chapter 18, that chance does not rule the world. That's on page 169. This mystery is only heightened when we turn the page to chapter 17, where the successes of these generals are assumed, and the change in state concerns what their successors did to mess things up. None of these Illyrian generals died in their bed, or most of them didn't, though their actions did reestablish an empire. What is going on here? And does Montesquieu paper it over? And if so, why? A lot is at stake here, because if these Illyrian generals had not begun the process of turning things around, there would have been no Constantine. And without Constantine, who knows what the history of the world would look like? I want to say that this is a very significant thing in the book. Montesquieu shows here the limits of sociology and the limits of the strictly modern approach to knowing things. Earlier in chapter 11, I had emphasized the sociological view of politics that Montesquieu was putting forward. Remember when he said this? If Caesar and Pompey had thought like Cato, others would have thought like Caesar and Pompey. The republic, destined to perish, would have been dragged to the precipice by another hand. The change of political form from the republic to the empire was, as Montesquieu says here, destined to happen. This suggests that there is no room for statesmanship. There is no way of overcoming the larger, broad trends on which the political community rides. It is the job, it seems, of political science to discover these trends and to show what the implications of those trends are for political life. Now compare the statement about Caesar and Cato to what he says about the Illyrian generals. He says that the empire was about to perish. Just as in the previous quotation about Caesar and Cato, he says the republic was destined to perish. Here, however, at the end of the crisis, 4 great men rose up and changed things, and preserved that empire or reestablished it. But for these men, history would have been much different, and Rome would have collapsed. Montesquieu never says anything like, if Gallienus had been an Aurelian, Aurelian would have been a Gallienus, or any such thing. Perhaps statesmanship matters after all. And if it does, it puts a hard limit on what can be explained through political science about politics. Montesquieu is very interested in establishing a political science along the lines of sociology. But he is also a philosopher who would like to understand human life. This little episode shows that much escapes political science understood as a deterministic sociological science. Montesquieu may help found sociology, but he also recognizes its limits and its unwisdom. Times limit statesmanship, but statesmanship can change times. So, although Montesquieu is silent on the question, we must ask, what did these Illyrian generals do to turn things around? In the next chapter, Montesquieu writes that there may be a sociological explanation for this. What restrained the military even more was that the riches of individuals and the wealth of the public had diminished, and the emperors could no longer make them such considerable gifts, so that the reward was no longer proportioned to the danger of instituting a new election. Now, clearly restraining the military was what mattered at this time. There was less to fight over and less stuff to bribe with, so infighting over spoils became less advantageous. Okay, maybe. But why is more military discipline the thing to expect under these circumstances? Why not the dissolution of the military? What actions did these Illyrian generals take to turn things around? The answer is a reinstitution of military discipline by tough guy emperors. Important changes in military strategy, including the building of walls by Aurelian to increase the defense around cities instead of on the frontier. Barbarians were allowed into the empire, but denied pillage and therefore became less interested in coming in. This meant military victory. Some religious reform, including an attempt to establish one god throughout the Roman Empire, the sun god that was supposed to lay on top of all the other local deities, was introduced by Aurelian, and he seems to begin the policy of one empire, one god. Thus we see here an example of what can be done. This prepares the way for others to do things, especially the change in the state and the new maxims adopted by the Romans that Montesquieu discusses in the next chapters. And we will discuss those things in the next video.